911.
It was clear there was a very violent murder.
I don't understand how any human being could have done that.
And it just hit me. This is the guy that was in the video.
Took 4 knives out of my van. I allowed you to take them.
A person who is simply sadistic.
I was afraid of the guy.
Somehow, 2 cruel individuals got together and hatched this plan.
53-year-old choir director Kathy Blair is approaching the busiest time in the calendar.
Kathy was always excited about the Christmas concert. That was our big concert of the year. The choir was her whole life. It was her passion project. She firmly believed that music makes life better.
Very nice. Little low, though. Okay, we're gonna readjust.
She became very much a mother figure to me, somebody that I felt like I could go to consistently. She taught thousands, actually thousands of kids. And she knew them all by name, and she cared about all of them. She cared about being there for all of you, not just for the creative side or the musical side, but for whatever you needed.
That was it. Feel great? You should. Hi, honey.
Hi, how was rehearsal?
Kathy's 23-year-old son, Joe, has just been accepted into naval school.
Actually, a couple of the guys and I were going to go out for some drinks to celebrate.
Without me. You have a good time.
Hey, I need you to come to my house right away. What's happening there, sir? The mom is dead. He's gonna go in and show my mom. What's your mom's name? Her name is Kathy Blair.
Also, 911 received a call from a caller that said that his mother was injured and needed police and EMS. When patrol officers got there and entered the house, they found the caller's mother was deceased.
Detective Derek Israel is called to take charge of the scene.
I was on call with the homicide unit. It was an ordinary middle-class home.
Is this the son?
The first thing I did when I got out there was to talk to the son of the deceased. He had been at a friend's house, and when he returned, he had come in to find his mother dead.
Go with the officer.
Detective Scanlon came out.
Where's the victim? In the house.
The first thing that I wanted to do is find out, is this a murder? Is it an accidental death, something else? The house was very neatly kept. It was well maintained, it was clean. When we got in, we found that Kathy Blair was laying on the floor next to the bed. And I saw what I immediately recognized to be stab wounds. It was clear that this was a murder.
The crime scene within the bedroom was like a very chaotic scene.
It was clear that there was a very dynamic and very violent struggle. It looked like she was kicking at her attacker, and her attacker stabbed her in the legs. And at some point, the attacker was able to get behind her and inflict the final wounds, which were slashing wounds, so on her neck.
Detective Israel pointed out to me that there are drawers from a jewelry cabinet sitting on the floor. They're all empty.
there were blood stains on the drawers. That told me that that jewelry was stolen after the murder because there was no blood before the murder. Also, we saw blood on a pillow that was missing a pillowcase in Kathy Blair's son's room.
So we're assuming that the pillowcase was used to carry out whatever was in the jewelry cabinet.
It's very unusual in my experience to find burglars who steal jewelry. Why would you steal a bunch of stuff that could be worth 50 cents when you could just take a laptop or a TV that you know what the value of that is? So that made it very unusual.
Forensics officers use UV lights and special chemicals to reveal potential clues.
When you have a bloody scene, it can lead to a lot of very helpful evidence. Blood is like ink. If you step in blood, then your shoe is like a stamp.
The shoe size was roughly a men's 10.
We were able to essentially track the killer as he moved throughout the house after the murder. We saw the footprints walk right up to the table that contained a bunch of what would normally be items stolen in burglaries, laptops, Kindles, other electronic items that could easily be sold for money. And then those bloody shoe impressions walked right out the back door.
The overlooked electrical goods leave detectives with a nagging thought.
There is a sense that this may be a staged burglary and therefore a targeted attack, in that Kathy was the victim of a murder by somebody that she knew, who then tried to stage the scene to look like a burglary had occurred.
Did your mom keep the door locked at night?
No.
There was no sign of forced entry to the house. Our initial hypothesis was that the killer had entered through the unlocked back door.
That leads us to believe that the attacker maybe had prior knowledge that Kathy doesn't normally lock the door. I am thinking about who are the people closest to Kathy Blair, and I'm going to know how their relationships were at the time that this happened.
Detective Scanlon finds out that Kathy Blair was recently divorced and her ex-husband lives an hour away.
I had somebody tell me that when she moved in to her new house, she didn't want him to know where it was at.
So we went to find out where he was and to either rule him in or rule him out as a suspect. The biggest thing you have going for you as a homicide investigator is that almost always a person is murdered by someone they know.
Hi, my name is Detective Scanlon. Where were you last night?
The ex-husband's alibi was that he was with his new girlfriend and they were like camping in an RV park in an area of Texas that was considerably further south, which we did later confirm.
Thank you very much for your time.
And just based on that and the lack of any other evidence linking him to it, he very quickly fell down the list of possible suspects.
Just as the investigation seems to hit a sudden dead end, Detective Israel receives an unexpected voicemail.
I get a call from a neighbor of Kathy's named Rob Leaf.
He was very bothered by the idea that a single woman was attacked in the middle of the night in his neighborhood.
He calls me to tell me that I need to come over to his house because he's got something I need to see. He was out in his neighborhood late at night testing out this new thermal imaging scope that he had.
Okay, let's see what you got.
He late at night. There's deer all over his neighborhood. So he took it out and to get some video of these deer.
What is that? Can you zoom in?
So while Rob Leaf was out taking video, a car pulled up.
Okay, keep playing.
It was about 2 blocks away, but because this is rifle scope, he was able to zoom in electronically. And the time on that was 1:16 a.m. in a very quiet neighborhood.
Who's that? Punch it.
Rob says the person got out of the car and walked all the way down the block and then turned onto Kathy Blair's street.
Can you rewind?
So my first thought is, this could be the killer.
The most peculiar thing about the video was just the way the guy walked. He has a very particular gait to his walk. It is something very distinct about him and particular, and he looks pretty tall.
We were very excited about it, but it was also very frustrating.
The detail that you're going to get from a thermal image is only going to be images of heat.
It did, though, tell us some very important things. First of all, the suspect was driving a car.
Pause there.
The car does have some distinct characteristics about it, like headlight shapes, you know, the grille, the low profile. So these are some things that we can look for.
As the investigation steps up, people close to Kathy Blair are still stunned.
I didn't know how to process it or understand it. I thought she was going to be there forever.
I was feeling so despondent. We had very little information, and it felt very confusing. We wanted the police department, the investigators, to find whoever had done this.
Israel.
A friend of Kathy Blair's had called us to let us know about something strange that had happened. A friend had arranged a little memorial at a local restaurant to just informally share their stories about her life. And suddenly this person no one recognized stood up and said, well, I didn't know Kathy Blair like y'all did, but I feel really bad for the fact that she's dead.
And of course, everybody in the room was like, who is this guy? You know, it is a little odd.
It turns out that one of the people who was there remembered that she had seen this person before because he was a cashier at a local department store.
Detectives head to the store and find the individual.
I'm Detective Israel, and this is Detective Scallion. Can we ask you a few questions about the murder?
We explained to him why people were suspicious, why we were talking to him.
I saw it on the news. I just wanted to pay my respects to her.
He gave us his whole timeline. At the time that Kathy Blair was murdered, he was in San Antonio.
But we followed him home, determined what kind of car that he drove.
This guy had a car that could be something like what's in that thermal imaging video.
Can you come meet us somewhere?
Detective Scanlon calls Rob Leaf, the man with the thermal imaging camera.
We want to just have you video this car and see if this looks like the car from night of the murder.
Let's see the car outside Kathy's house.
Rob Leaf has sent footage of the potential suspect's car.
Are they the same?
Well, once we actually finally looked at the video, it did not look anything like it.
It's completely different.
I hate to say it, it's kind of disappointing. But you have to follow the evidence, and in this case, the evidence didn't show that this guy was involved.
Israel,
Shortly after, Detective Israel receives some disturbing news.
Scanlon, we've got another murder. What have you got?
The victims in this case were two elderly individuals, a husband and wife, named Sidney and Billy Shelton. This was a very vulnerable pair of individuals, and they were both found in their bed. I saw that there was a knife sticking out of the eye of Billy Shelton, the female victim of this case. This was clearly a murder perpetrated by a person who is simply sadistic and enjoys the act of murder.
It was shocking. It really was. The Sheltons had been together probably close to 60 years. Sidney Shelton was a very kind man, never a negative word from him. Billy was very talkative, very sweet, bubbly. They were just quiet and modest. Everybody knew them. Everybody knew the Sheltons in that neighborhood.
Mrs. Shelton had a small jewelry box, and all the drawers had been removed from that and stacked up as well, just like a miniature version of what I saw in Kathy Blair's house.
The similarities between the two crimes are alarming.
Nighttime burglaries are extremely unusual. This is Texas. People have guns, and they're allowed to shoot you when you come in the house and burglarize it at night.
The new crime scene is just a 15-minute drive from Kathy Blair's home.
For two such burglaries to happen in such a short period of time, it made me and Detective Scanlon firmly believe that we're looking for the same person in both these cases.
Detectives fear that instead of a burglar, this could be the work of a serial killer.
We realized that the clock was working against us.
We can't wait and let another murder happen.
If we could figure out a link between these victims, we felt that sitting right at that link would be our killer. We began the painstaking and slow process of looking to see, do they have the same dentist? Do they have the same dog groomer? Do they have the same pizza delivery person? Anything that might connect these people together. One of the people who Detective Scanlon spoke to mentioned that back in May, Kathy had a handyman come to her house, and this guy kind of creeped her out.
I said, do you remember that guy's name? And he goes, well, yeah, I absolutely do. The guy's name was Tim Parlin. He told me that Tim had been in prison.
Timothy Parlin did work back in May for Kathy Blair. He was also a member of the Sheltons Church.
What we learned from researching Tim Parlin was very disturbing. Parlin was arrested back in 1993 for a burglary in the middle of the night. And also what was interesting about this burglary was that he had an accomplice.
He had told his accomplice, if these people come home or wake up or something and confront us, you're just gonna have to kill them. That to me was like really consistent with the two murder scenes that we were looking at.
The detectives head to the In-Town Suites, a long-stay hotel where Tim Parlin is living with his wife. Parlin recently reported one of his two minivans had been stolen.
Timothy Parlin? Yes?
It was clear that we're homicide detectives. Detective Scanlon, who was with me, was wearing a jacket that said Austin Police Homicide on it.
Aren't you guys here about my stolen car?
We're like, that's not why we're here to talk to you.
He didn't seem fazed by the fact that he's talking to two homicide detectives.
The detectives tell Parlin they are contacting people who were connected to both Kathy Blair and the Sheltons.
He was cooperative. He didn't seem like he was nervous.
We asked, can we search your van? He said, absolutely, you can search my van. He found some old knives, rusty knives. It didn't look likely that these were our murder weapon. So we said, hey, could we take DNA? And he said, sure, I'll give you a sample of my DNA. And we took a swab right there.
What were you doing between midnight and 4 a.m. on December 6th?
He said he was working at 7-Eleven, which was right up the road from where he was staying at that motel.
And we also asked about his room, and could we go look in his room? And there, Tim Parlin didn't want to cooperate with this. He said, my wife works nights, and she's asleep right now. I don't want to disturb her. So, of course, we're working on Tim Parlin's voluntary cooperation. So if he doesn't want us to search the room, we can't search the room. So we concluded our interview with Tim Parlin. It wasn't until the next day that we were able to go over to the 7-Eleven to talk to the manager.
Did an employee called Timothy Parlin work here on the 6th of December?
They advised that Tim Parlin was terminated from the store a week before the murder happened.
Now we had him lying about what he was doing that night. And suddenly, Timothy Parlin became our prime suspect. And I want to search his apartment.
The detectives hatch a plan to get inside.
While Tim was gone, Detective Israel went to try to talk to his wife, Anna Parlin.
We're investigating a murder that took place.
His wife answered. And I explained what we were investigating. She was very upset about the murder of the Sheltons. And in fact, she told us that if Tim Parlin had anything to do with it, that she would divorce him.
Did your husband give you the necklace you're wearing?
He did.
She gave us permission to search the hotel room where they were staying. We found some other little pieces of jewelry, and we found some prescription drugs in a pocket of one of Tim Parlin's jackets, which he didn't have a prescription for. And finally, we found a pawn receipt from an item of jewelry that Tim Parlin pawned on December 6th, the night of Kathy Blair's murder.
Detectives have seen enough. They bring Parlin into the station for questioning.
So we talked about maybe what you might have been doing or if you had been working, and you said you thought maybe you may have been working that day. So,
or I was with my wife, one or the other.
So we went to the work.
I think I was still employed there at that time.
Yeah, and you weren't employed, and you weren't working during that week. And we're, conducting a murder investigation. Here's an interesting thing, okay? You have Kathy Blair, right? You were over at her house. Here's the deal, too, okay?
Yeah.
Weird coincidence. The Sheltons, you also have a connection to the Sheltons, too.
Are you liking me for this thing, or are you liking to try to, make sure that I'm not liked for this thing?
What I'm trying to do is, if you did it, I want to get the proof on you. If you didn't do it, I want to get you out of the way as soon as I possibly can.
Yeah, I want to do the same thing.
And here's what I
didn't do it.
Okay, I get it.
He had to control the conversation when he was being interviewed, to redirect the questioning.
I have a curiosity question. You took 4 knives out of my van. I allowed you to take them. Shouldn't that be on the expediency list? You know, because I allowed you to do it.
Sure. And it was very hard to get around this anytime that you were talking to him. But at that point, we did not have enough to charge him with the murder.
All right, just stay here, okay?
Timothy Parlin, however, remains a major suspect. Despite their grief, Kathy Blair's colleagues and students hold the concert in her memory.
They invited everybody who had ever been a student of hers to come up and sing. And the risers were just full of people. And so I got up and I tried to, but I was just crying the whole time, so I don't think I actually sang a note. The choir was her whole life. It was her passion project. It was the thing she believed in the most. All she thought about was getting music to as many kids as possible.
There was a piece of jewelry that Tim Parlin had pawned the evening after we found Kathy Blair's body. It was like a gold nugget pendant. We showed a photograph of that pawn receipt to Kathy Blair's son and to the Shelton family, and they didn't recognize it.
But detectives want to find out if Timothy Parlin did pawn anything belonging to the murder victims that evening.
When we got to the pawn shop, there was an outdoor camera that recorded the vehicles in their parking lot. And there was an inside camera that recorded the actual transaction at the counter.
Detectives cue the footage up to 7 p.m., just before the pawn transaction was made.
Is that him?
That's our guy. Stop. Rewind. Zoom in.
When he made that pawn transaction, we didn't see any evidence of more than one piece of jewelry.
Switch to exterior cameras.
Tim Parlin pawns a necklace and leaves the store.
Freeze that image.
Zoom in.
Parlin said he only drove a van, so how come he's in a car?
Tim Parlin, if nothing else, is a great liar. He wasn't driving a van, he was driving a car.
Detectives compare the vehicle to the footage filmed by Rob Leaf on the night of the murder.
From the angle that I'm looking at it, it could be a car that, you know, matches what is in the thermal imaging video.
That led us back to Tim Parlin's hotel where he was staying. We started talking to people there, staff members who worked there, and we asked them, do you remember Tim Parlin ever driving something besides a van? And a couple people said, yes, he was driving a green car, and I think it was a Toyota. I called one of the detectives who works in our strategic intelligence unit, and very quickly she came back and said, well, his sister has a green Toyota.
Tim Parlin's sister allows police to examine the car back at the department garage.
One of our crime scene technicians started processing the car, and she observed some reddish-brown stains in the passenger side of the car, down in the footwell where your feet go, and on the front of the seat, like where the back of your legs might touch it.
The stains were swabbed. They were later submitted to our DNA lab, and they were processed and profiled.
The results come back. The marks are blood.
What we found out very quickly was the blood in the green Toyota Camry that Tim Parlin had been driving was from Kathy Blair. We knew we had our guy. issue a warrant for Tim Parlin, wanted to bring him in and talk to him. And this time I confronted him.
Here's the deal. Here's the deal, okay? You got blood of murder in the car. All this evidence, and it goes right down and points at you.
I had him rock solid. So I'm expecting Timothy Parlin to tell me some sob story about why he did this.
But Parlin has other ideas.
His mind starts thinking, and he says, well, I didn't do it, but I know who did.
Somebody else did
That
it.
kind of help you out right now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, you're still going to throw me in a pokey.
Yeah, but in the end, it all sorts out. If those guys did it, and you give me that information, how could I possibly charge you?
All right, that's recorded. That's recorded what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. Every word I say.
Okay. You already got his sister here in jail already.
Okay. Tell me more.
Sean Gant. That's
Okay.
it.
He said the guy who did the murders was named Sean Gant Benalcazar. I knew Tim would have no trouble just making up a name. Now I'm left to the situation that I have to figure out who Sean Gant Benalcazar is, find him, clear him of any wrongdoing, and then I can charge Tim Parlin. Tim Parlin said that Sean's sister was a Vanessa Benalcazar, who was incarcerated at the Travis County Jail. So I went and talked to her.
So why are you in here?
She had severe substance abuse issues with methamphetamines. And we learned she was in jail after a disturbance that she had with an individual.
Did you ever talk to Timothy Parlin?
And what she told me was, Tim Parlin is always talking about doing burglaries. Tim Parlin is always trying to recruit people to do burglaries.
Do you know where Sean lives?
What I learned is that Sean doesn't even live in Austin. Sean lives in Galveston. Galveston's 3 hours away from Austin. This guy had no criminal background. In fact, he was a very unlikely candidate to be a murderer. He had a degree from the University of Texas. And I figured, well, I could probably knock this guy out just with a phone call.
Hello, is this Sean?
He answers the phone, and I introduce myself.
When's the last time you were in Austin?
He finally gives me a date. It's the date of Kathy Blair's murder, that weekend. And the next date he gives me is the date when the Sheltons were born. I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. So now I have two possible suspects. One guy who I know is a bad dude, and I have another guy who's never done anything bad that I could tell in his whole life.
Detectives bring Sean Gant Benalcazar in.
We've always been be comfortable.
They want details on his trips to Austin.
Sean starts describing how he was going to stay with Tim.
I was down there basically to figure out what was going on with my sister.
Right.
I'm fairly certain I came in at about 11 o'clock on the 5th. And, yeah, I met with him briefly, and he said that his girlfriend or wife or whatever was in the room, so I couldn't go in. So to go off and do whatever.
Sean said that when he got to Austin, after driving 4.5 hours, Tim Parlin told Sean to go and make himself busy for a couple of hours. It just doesn't make sense. Now we're starting to think maybe Sean's trying to cover something for Tim Parlin.
So one technique that we used was simply to say, okay, great. This is going to be really easy for us to figure out if you're telling the truth, because we're going to get your cell phone data,
And that data actually allows us to pinpoint the location of a phone at any given time. Obviously, we do the same thing with Tim's phone.
So they continue, and the story changes a little bit.
He's like, oh, wait, well, hold on. Well, actually, Tim wanted to go and visit someone, so we went and visited.
He'd, park in front of people's houses.
So did he stop and get out of the car?
So he got out and, went over to the house for a few minutes.
Do you remember the name of the street?
No, I never remember street names.
I said, what did you think he was doing? Oh, well, I knew he was, casing a house or going into a house.
Did you get out of the car, too?
No.
I said, okay, was he carrying anything when he came back? Yes, I think he was carrying something. What was he carrying? Well, he was carrying a white bag. It had blood all over it. And what did he do with the white bag?
Well, he just threw it in the back seat and didn't say anything about it. And I was like, half asleep. So I was just like, whatever, are we going?
He was getting more nervous as it went on. At one point, he takes the jacket off because he's getting hotter as he's getting more concerned about how things are going. We get to the point where a few hours into this interview, and everyone's tired, and we're like, let's take a break. Does anyone need to use the restroom? So we all get up, we all go out of the room, and Sean walks to the restroom.
And I looked up as everybody's walking in front of me, and I see Sean Gant Benalcazar's walk. The gait, the broadness of his shoulders, the very deliberate steps.
Israel.
And it just hit me right there in the hall. Oh, wow. This is the guy that was in the video.
Yes.
When you look at the shape of the individual, these square shoulders, very different than Tim Parlin, who's a bigger guy, he's shorter, he's a little rounder, and just the way they carry themselves. It was clear that that video was Sean and not Tim Parlin. And once we realized that, it changed everything. When Sean came back into the interview room and sat down, then we started questioning him based on that thought.
What were you wearing?
Pants and a long sleeve shirt.
What size is that?
I don't know, 11 probably.
The same as the impression that we found at Kathy Blair's.
So where are you sitting in the car?
Passenger seat.
Gant Benalcazar said that Parlin threw a bloody bag in the back seat.
And I said, well, here's the problem. So we've looked at that car and there's not blood in the back seat. There's only blood in the front seat.
And when you're sitting in that seat, and the person who was sitting in that seat had blood on them, that would make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the person sitting in that seat must have been the murderer.
I mean, what are you saying?
What we're saying is you went in the house. That's what we're saying. And we can prove that, okay? If your cell phone shows you inside the house, you have to explain it.
I was afraid of the guy.
Right.
He was threatening my family, okay? I didn't want my family in jeopardy.
Okay.
And we're close, and I couldn't let that happen. I mean, he told me to go in the house and get the stuff, and so I snuck in, and she was fast asleep. She woke up, and I stabbed her in the neck. I didn't even want to do it, but I was trying to get the jewelry without doing it.
So I was elated to have this confession from Sean.
All right, so this So what we're going to need to do for right now is we're going to place you under arrest for capital murder.
After reading him his rights, he was asking him, well, let's talk about, the Sheltons. And that's when Sean said, I don't want to talk anymore.
The big question, of course, is why Kathy Blair? Why Billy and Sidney Shelton? Why would these people be murdered?
Detective Israel takes Tim Parlin out of jail for answers.
The first thing I did was apologize to him. And I said, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I've checked out your story and you're right. Sean's confessed to this murder.
But Parlin rejects the idea that he coerced his accomplice into the robbery and murder and claims he was caught up in Sean Gant Benalcazar's own revenge mission.
Tim Parlin said Sean was upset at an individual who had gotten his sister in some trouble. And he decided he wanted to kill that guy. And he lived in Austin. So they hatched this plan, and that is they would start killing people so it looked like a random serial killer murdering people in Austin, stealing jewelry and other items. And then when they killed the actual people they wanted to kill, no one would connect it to them.
Parlin says he had viewed Kathy Blair and the Sheltons as easy targets for burglary, but claims Sean Gant Benalcazar wanted to murder them as part of his cover-up.
Now, bear in mind this comes from Tim Parlin, who is a pathological liar, so who knows?
Though the main driver behind the murders remains unconfirmed, Texas law demands that people complicit in a crime are held equally responsible. Timothy Parlin is found guilty in all 3 murders. With insufficient evidence linking Sean Gant Benalcazar to the Sheltons, he is found guilty only for the murder of Kathy Blair. Both are sentenced to life. No one else was found to be involved.
We were totally wrong. Tim Parlin, although was completely culpable, he was not the one who had actually gone in and committed Kathy Blair's murder. It was Sean.
The thermal camera captures Parlin's car on Kathy Blair's block and Sean Gant Benalcazar walking towards your house.
He entered through the unlocked back door. And went into Kathy Blair's bedroom. Kathy Blair spent her final moments on Earth, having no idea why she was being attacked.
Then he staged the scene to look like a burglary had occurred. All very similar to the Sheltons' murder.
Somehow, 2 of the cruelest individuals got together and hatched this plan. No one really gained anything from the death of Kathy Blair, from the Sheltons. It was meaningless. Getting Sean and Tim off the streets is probably one of the most important accomplishments that I had in my police career.
I doubt I'll ever forget the really, key elements of it, people involved, beginning with the victims, of course.
I look at the mugshots of the people that did it, and I don't see people. I just see animals, because I don't understand how any human being could have done that to anybody, but especially to her. And finding any part of my heart that can forgive them has not happened yet.
I like to remember Sidney and Billy just for the good life that they lived and the happy life that...
The heavy, suffocating silence of an autumn night in 1999 A night where the frost began to bite early and the leaves turned to brittle, skeletal remains underfoot, is a memory that has haunted this town like a restless ghost for over 2 decades. It was the kind of evening that felt normal until the precise second it wasn't. A routine Tuesday that would eventually become the anchor for an obsession that consumed detectives, terrified parents, and shattered the illusion of suburban sanctity forever. We are talking about the vanishing of a life, a disappearance so sudden and so absolute that it defied the laws of probability, leaving behind only a trail of questions that spiraled into the dark, cold abyss of an unsolvable mystery. The victim, a bright, ambitious soul whose laughter was once the heartbeat of her household, had simply stepped out to run a quick, inconsequential errand, a trip to a neighborhood store that should have taken 10 minutes, yet stretched into 24 years of agonizing, hollow-chested uncertainty. When the clock struck midnight and the porch light remained the only thing illuminating the driveway, the dread began to creep in, thick and icy, a physical presence that clung to the windows and doors. The 911 call that followed wasn't just a request for help. It was the start of a nightmare that would rewrite the history of this entire county. Patrol cars arrived with sirens that seemed to wail into an empty void, their flashing lights casting long, distorted shadows across a scene that offered absolutely no clues, no struggle, no discarded items, nothing but the crushing weight of an absence. It was as if the earth itself had opened up, swallowed the truth, and sealed itself shut, leaving the police to stare into the abyss of a case that would quickly transition from a missing person report into a legend of dread. The community, initially paralyzed by the shock of the unknown, began to turn inward, the bonds of trust fraying as every neighbor became a potential suspect and every unlocked door became a source of terror. Families installed deadbolts that felt flimsy against the invisible specter of the abduction, and the parks that were once filled with the sounds of childhood became desolate, forbidden zones. The mystery wasn't just in the disappearance, it was in the eerie precision of it. The lack of a witness, the absence of a getaway vehicle, the way the night air had seemed to reclaim her without a single trace of violence. It was a cold case born in the shadow of a changing millennium, a time of analog fading into digital, leaving behind a black hole that swallowed every investigative effort, every forensic lead, and every desperate prayer. The detectives, men who had spent their lives pulling threads of truth from the tangle of human tragedy, found themselves staring at a blank slate that refused to be written upon. They walked the same paths, interviewed the same people, and revisited the same dark corners until the routine became a ritual of despair, a cycle of failure that left them aged, weary, and hollowed out by the sheer, unblinking eyes of the case file that mocked their best efforts. Years turned into a decade, and the decade bled into the relentless, unforgiving progression of 2, but the haunting of 1999 never subsided. It only grew more potent, more pervasive, embedding itself into the local lore like a dark, indelible stain. You could see it in the way the older generation looked at the streets, the way they hesitated before speaking the victim's name, as if uttering it too loudly might disturb the thin, fragile surface of the reality they had tried to patch over. The case files gathered dust, but they were never cold. They pulsed with the static electricity of an unresolved debt, a story that demanded an ending which the universe refused to provide. Investigators retired, passing their notes to younger, perhaps more cynical successors, but even they couldn't escape the gravitational pull of the mystery, the way the evidence, or the lack thereof, would haunt them in the quiet hours of their own lives. We're looking at a case that defied the advancements of technology, standing tall and impenetrable against the tide of forensic breakthroughs that cracked open so many other crimes of that era, leaving this one to fester in the dark. It was a singular failure of the system, a crack in the pavement of justice that society had learned to walk around, ignoring the chasm that lay beneath until it became a part of the landscape. But the truth, as it always does, possesses a gravity of its own, a silent, creeping momentum that ignores the ticking of the clock and the fading of memories, waiting for the precise, tectonic shift in circumstances that would finally bring the hidden to light. It wasn't until the breakthrough, A discovery so chillingly mundane in its origin that it made the blood run cold, that the entire architecture of the case began to shift, revealing a motive that was as disturbingly human as it was grotesque. We are talking about a discovery buried in the records of a life lived in the shadow, a glitch in the machine of a predator who thought he had outrun his own history, a man who had built a life of normalcy on a foundation of stolen time and suffocated potential. When the police finally circled the address, when the tactical teams breached the perimeter, the air didn't just vibrate with the tension of an arrest. It screamed with the echoes of 1999, the sudden, violent intersection of a long-dead past and a present that was no longer willing to look away. The suspect, a man whose face had been a fixture in the local periphery, someone who had likely stood in the same grocery aisles, sat in the same diners, and perhaps even offered condolences to the family at the height of their suffering, was unmasked not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, clinical efficiency of the law finally catching its prey. He stood in the doorway, a man defined by the banality of his existence, his hands finally empty of the secrets he had held for 24 years, his eyes devoid of the spark of humanity that one expects in the face of such a reckoning. The interrogation room was a sterile, unforgiving box, the light harsh and unflinching as it bore down upon a man who had spent 2 decades hiding in plain sight, his soul a graveyard of forgotten, buried horrors. As the detectives began to peel back the layers of his carefully constructed life, they discovered a diary of shadows, a record of events that chilled them to the core, detailing not just the night of 1999, but the entire, terrifying trajectory of a predator who had found his thrill in the absolute control over another person's fate. The details that emerged were not merely graphic. They were deeply, psychologically disturbing, revealing a mind that had commodified the agony of his victim, turning her terror into a private sanctuary where he could retreat whenever the demands of the real world became too heavy. The arrest wasn't just the closing of a case. It was the tearing open of a wound that the entire community had been forced to live with, a revelation so visceral and so jarring that it threatened to redefine everything they knew about the people they lived next to, the streets they walked, and the very concept of safety. Every neighbor who had ever thought twice about a strange glance or a lingering look was now vindicated, their paranoia transformed into a cold, hard fact, a realization that the monster wasn't under the bed. He was mowing the lawn. He was waving from the porch. He was standing at the edge of the playground, watching with the unblinking hunger of a beast. The narrative that emerged from those hours of intense, relentless questioning painted a picture of a man who had not only stolen a life, but had also stolen the peace of an entire generation, his silence a deliberate, calculated weapon that he had wielded with the precision of a surgeon. The motive was not a crime of passion or a sudden, fleeting burst of animal instinct. It was a cold, deliberate experiment in possession, a desire so perverse that it defied the standard psychological archetypes, forcing the detectives to reach into the darkest corners of their training to find the language for what they were hearing. He spoke of the night of 1999 as if it were a masterpiece he had curated, a moment of perfect control that he had revisited in his own mind every day since, relishing the power he held in that moment of transition, the way the light had left her eyes, the way the sound of the world had faded as he pulled her into the dark. It was a confession that didn't just implicate him. It condemned the entire notion of the unknown perpetrator, suggesting that for all those years, the answer had been hiding within the very social circle they had investigated time and time again, shielded by his ability to act, to mimic, to be the person that nobody would ever look at twice. The community's reaction was a storm of raw, unadulterated grief, mixed with a burning, white-hot fury, a desire for retribution that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement of the town, shaking the foundations of every house. People gathered in the park where she was last seen, not with candles or signs, but with a heavy, pregnant silence, a collective mourning that was finally, after so long, being directed at a target. They wanted to know why. They wanted to know how he had been allowed to exist for so long, and they wanted to know how they were supposed to move forward in a world where the monster had been a household name. The detectives, meanwhile, were struggling with their own ghosts, The realization that they had sat across from him during the initial investigation, that they had shaken his hand, that they had looked into his face and seen nothing but a concerned citizen, a failure of intuition that would plague them for the rest of their careers. The trial itself was a theater of the grotesque, a long, agonizing public display of the inner workings of a mind that had been corrupted by its own absolute, unchecked desires, the courtroom becoming a vessel for the collective trauma of the town. Every testimony, every forensic slide, every piece of recovered evidence was a hammer blow against the collective psyche, a reminder of the fragility of the life they had taken for granted and the proximity of the evil that had been stalking them all along. The suspect's defense, a frantic, scrambling effort to prove mental instability, failed against the sheer, overwhelming, and damning consistency of the evidence. The physical traces of the victim in the secret, underground sanctum he had built, the personal items he had hoarded, the records of his own narcissistic obsession with the crime. It was impossible to argue for insanity when the actions were so methodical, so deliberate, and so deeply embedded in the logic of a predator who had spent decades refining his craft. The victim's family, those brave, broken souls who had carried the burden of the missing for so long, finally found their moment of reckoning, not as a closure to their grief, but as a validation of the nightmare they had been living in. Their presence in the courtroom was a silent, imposing force, their eyes a mirror reflecting the magnitude of the loss and the depth of the hunger for justice that had finally been fed. The jury, faced with the weight of it all, reached their decision with a speed that spoke to the irrefutability of the evidence, the word guilty falling into the room like a stone into a deep, dark well, the sound of it echoing through the corridors of the building and reaching out to the streets outside. But the guilty verdict was only the beginning of the aftermath, the start of a new, different kind of struggle as the community began the long, winding process of trying to integrate this terrifying truth into their daily lives. How do you go to work? How do you raise your children? How do you walk your dog when you know that the face of your neighbor has been replaced by the face of the monster you feared in your nightmares? The town became a place of whispers, a collective, silent reassessment of their own history, looking back at the last 24 years not as a series of events, but as a period of profound, invisible danger. Every memory was being recontextualized, every friendship re-examined, the very structure of their communal life turning into a hall of mirrors where no reflection could be trusted. The detectives who had finally cracked the case found no peace, only a different kind of burden. The knowledge that they had once held the predator in their hands and let him go, a mistake that would haunt the architecture of their consciences until their final days. The truth, while liberating, was not a bomb. It was an acid, eating away at the comfort they had once felt in their own skin, demanding a level of awareness that was physically exhausting. As the months passed, the town slowly, painfully began to rebuild, the physical reminders of the crime being removed, the secret room in the suspect's house demolished, the house itself leveled to the dirt, as if the soil could finally be purged of the stain. The victim's name, once spoken in hushed, fearful tones, was now whispered with a reverence that felt like a reclaiming of her spirit, a way of honoring the life that had been snatched away before it could ever really begin. A small, quiet memorial was built in the park, a place where people could come to sit and think about the passage of time, the resilience of the human spirit, and the terrifying, unpredictable nature of the world. It was a place for the community to acknowledge that they had been broken, and that while they were trying to put the pieces back together, the cracks would always remain. They were a people living in the wake of a catastrophe, a community that had seen the face of the abyss and had been forced to learn how to exist on the edge, their eyes always scanning, their hearts always guarded. The suspect, now locked away in a high-security prison, a life term in a cage that was the only appropriate answer to his own self-made dungeon, had become a cipher, a man stripped of everything but the memory of his own perverse legacy. He was a creature who had lived in the dark and now lived in the light of absolute containment, a man who had no power, no audience, and no future, his only existence now defined by the rules of the walls that surrounded him. And yet, there was a part of the town that couldn't let go, a part of the collective consciousness that remained tethered to the trauma, forever waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was the legacy of the cold case, the way it had rewritten the operating system of their lives, making them look for patterns in the chaos and monsters in the mundane. The fear had not disappeared. It had just evolved, becoming a part of their DNA, a subtle, underlying pulse that made them more cautious, more guarded, and perhaps more aware of the fragility of the peace they had regained. I find myself thinking about the diary again, the one found in the suspect's home, the record of those stolen moments, the way he had chronicled the life he had extinguished, turning her existence into his own, sick version of a story. It was the most damning piece of evidence, a narrative of the theft of a soul, and it served as the core of the case against him, the proof that this wasn't an event, but a lifelong, deliberate, and consuming project. The detectives had spent hours reading those pages, their hands shaking as they turned them, the words acting as a bridge into a mind that had been completely, utterly lost to its own narcissism. They were the ones who had to carry the knowledge of what had been in those pages, and they were the ones who would have to reconcile it with the fact that they had once, long ago, almost caught him. It was a failure of the system, a failure of their own perception, and a failure that would, inevitably, be a part of their own internal, private history. The town, as I leave it for the last time, feels like a ghost of itself, a place that is trying to grow around the scar, the new buildings and the new people a testament to the fact that life, even when it is interrupted by the most horrific of events, will find a way to persist. I see the children playing on the same sidewalks where she walked. I see the parents walking with the same cautious vigilance, and I understand that the cold case, while finally solved, has left behind a permanent, living, breathing shadow. They are a community that has learned the hardest possible lesson, that the darkness is not just in the world, but in the people, and that the only thing standing between them and the abyss is the fragile, often unreliable, and deeply human effort of the people who refuse to look away. The case is closed, the files are in the archives, and the man who committed the crime will spend the rest of his days in a cage, but the haunting of 1999 remains, a quiet, persistent, and undeniable part of their collective soul. As I drive away, the sun setting in a brilliant, violent explosion of red and orange, the town in the rearview mirror feels like a memory, a snapshot of a place that was forced to confront the worst of its own nature and is now trying to find a way to stand up and walk into a future that is, for the first time, not dictated by the past. It's a place that has been touched by the absolute, and in that touch, it has been changed forever. A community that knows the true meaning of the word unsolved and understands the heavy, terrible, and absolute cost of finally learning the truth. The long wait for justice was over, but the echo of the 1999 disappearance, the ghost that had lived with them for so long, would continue to resonate, a low, persistent sound in the background of their lives, a reminder of the night the light went out and the long, slow, and often agonizing journey it took to finally turn it back on. The mystery was gone, the questions were answered, and the nightmare was over, but the shadow, for all its movement, would always be a part of the house, a part of the street, and a part of the history of a town that had finally found the truth. The investigation, once a static, frozen landscape of dead-end leads and abandoned theories, began to thaw with a terrifying intensity as the forensic breakthroughs from the suspect's arrest rippled through the precinct. It wasn't just the physical evidence. The bone-chilling artifacts recovered from the hidden, subterranean room in the suspect's basement, but the sheer, sprawling documentation of a life lived in dual parallel, one public, one monstrously private. The detectives who had inherited the 1999 case file, the men who had lived with the victim's face staring at them from their desktops for years, now found themselves wading through a sea of journals and digital records that laid bare the internal logic of a predator who had operated with the patience of a spider. The motive, as it emerged from the debris of his home, was not just about control. It was a disturbing testament to a man who had viewed the victim not as a person, but as a project, a life he had been obsessively tracking, studying, and waiting to dismantle long before the night she vanished. Every piece of evidence brought into the light forced the detectives to re-examine the original investigation, and with every step, the realization dawned that they hadn't been failing to find a killer, they had been failing to see the person who was standing right in front of them, blending into the community as seamlessly as a shadow on a wall. The suspect's house, now a restricted zone taped off from the neighborhood, became a focal point for the forensic teams, their white-clad figures moving through the rooms like ghosts, uncovering the physical remnants of a nightmare that had been thriving in the very heart of the town. They found personal items, trinkets that had been taken as trophies, items that had long ago been reported as lost or misplaced, all meticulously preserved in a collection that spoke to a level of psychological depravity that defied standard criminal profiling. It was a discovery that didn't just break the case. It broke the people who were working it, forcing them to look at the victim's disappearance not as a crime of opportunity, but as the result of a calculated, lifelong obsession. As the detectives worked, the town was undergoing its own parallel reckoning, a slow-motion explosion of realization as the suspect's true identity leaked into the public consciousness. Neighbors who had shared fences, friends who had participated in the same social clubs, and parents who had trusted him with their children began to recount moments that now, in the light of the truth, felt like flashes of impending horror. The way he would watch the playground, the specific questions he would ask about family routines, the unsettling, lingering intensity of his gaze. It was a retroactive trauma, a community-wide realization that they had been providing a cloak of normalcy to a man who was systematically destroying the foundation of their lives. The fear that had once been abstract and external, a monster in the dark, was now internal and intimate, a realization that the horror had been sitting at their dinner tables and sharing their air. The interrogation room, where the suspect sat for hours on end, became the epicenter of a psychological confrontation that would later be studied by experts in the field. He was a master of evasion, a man who had honed the art of the lie to such an extreme that he seemed to believe in his own innocence. But the detectives were no longer looking for a confession. They were looking for the truth behind the diary, the rationale behind the cruelty, and the mechanism of his control. When he finally began to speak, his voice was flat, a monotone delivery that robbed the most horrific details of their emotional weight, making them sound like inventory reports from a business. He talked about the night of the abduction with a chilling, surgical detachment, describing the abduction as an intervention in her life, a way for him to take control of a narrative he had been obsessively following since she was a teenager. It was a perspective that forced the interrogators to push back their chairs, to look away from the mirror, and to confront the fact that they were dealing with a mind that had completely uncoupled itself from the moral baseline of human experience. The evidence presented by the prosecution in the preliminary hearings became a roadmap of psychological terror. They showed the jury the maps he had kept, the routes he had traced, the way he had studied the police response during the first 48 hours of the 1999 investigation, and used that knowledge to refine his own camouflage. It was a masterclass in criminal intelligence, a demonstration of how a predator could effectively weaponize the very systems designed to protect the public. The family of the victim, who had spent decades waiting for this moment, found themselves in a courtroom where the abstract loss they had endured was being translated into a terrifying, concrete reality. They were forced to hear the intimate details of their daughter's life being dissected by a man who had turned her existence into his own, sick version of a reality-warping experiment. Throughout the town, the atmosphere grew heavy, a pressure that seemed to squeeze the light out of the days. The local media, which had once been a source of information, now became a conveyor belt of nightmares, every report adding a new layer of detail to the growing, horrific picture of the suspect's life. The town was no longer a place of familiar streets, it was a museum of trauma. Every corner, every doorway, and every public space was now associated with the suspect's movements, the evidence of his presence everywhere, if you only knew where to look. The detectives continued their work, their exhaustion a constant, physical presence, but they were driven by a sense of duty that transcended the normal bounds of the job. They were no longer just catching a criminal. They were cleaning up the wreckage of a life that had been systematically dismantled by a man who had used the town as his personal hunting ground. The discovery of the hidden bunker, a concrete reinforced space deep beneath the foundations of his garage, sent a new wave of shock through the legal and forensic teams. It was a space designed for total isolation, a place where time had been measured not in days or weeks, but in the slow, agonizing depletion of hope. The forensic team, using ground-penetrating radar, had uncovered the structure only after the suspect had finally, under the weight of unrelenting pressure, hinted at the existence of a repository for his memories. When they breached the heavy, steel-reinforced door, the air inside was still, cold, and heavy with the dust of decades. It wasn't a room. It was a tomb that had been built to be lived in, a testament to the sheer, terrifying scale of the suspect's patience and the absolute, total nature of his control. The impact of this discovery on the courtroom proceedings was immediate and devastating. The defense team, which had been trying to argue for a limited, opportunistic involvement in the disappearance, saw their entire strategy collapse in an instant. There was no room for impulse when faced with a structural, deliberate, and permanent manifestation of a killer's intent. The bunker became the physical manifestation of the motive, a cold, hard, and undeniable piece of evidence that defined the suspect's life as one long, committed project of abduction and entrapment. The jury, faced with the photos of the interior, the small, barren sleeping area, the shelf of personal items, the way the walls had been reinforced to ensure no sound could ever reach the outside, were visibly shaken, their resolve hardening into a singular, cold demand for justice. In the days that followed the reveal of the bunker, the town seemed to go silent, a quiet, mournful hush falling over the streets. The horror of what had been happening just a few feet below the surface, beneath the manicured lawns and the suburban calm, was finally being absorbed. People didn't just feel fear. They felt a profound, primal violation, a sense that the fundamental safety of their lives had been a thin, pathetic illusion. They were a community that had lived with a secret that was literally and figuratively buried beneath their own feet. The detectives, meanwhile, continued the long, agonizing process of mapping the site, their work a clinical, forensic act of reconstruction that would provide the evidence needed for the final, definitive trial. They weren't just gathering facts. They were gathering the pieces of a life that had been systematically erased by a man who had thrived in the dark of their own ignorance. As I sat in the precinct late one night, the hum of the computers and the rhythm of the city outside serving as the only background noise, the lead detective, a man who had dedicated the last 15 years of his career to this single file, looked at the stacks of reports on his desk. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the details, a man who had seen the worst of what a human being could do and had lived to tell the tale. He spoke of the haunting not as a metaphor, but as a literal presence, a weight that followed him from the interrogation room to his own home, a constant, low-frequency pressure in his mind. He was ready for the trial to end, ready for the verdict, but he was also struggling with the reality of what would come after, the silence that would follow the final gavel, the void that would open up once the investigation was truly, fully, and finally over. The suspect, deep in the isolation of his prison cell, had stopped speaking entirely, his silence, now a new kind of weapon, a final act of control in a life that had been defined by the desire to keep things from the world. The investigation had moved into the phase of trial preparation, the legal team building a case that was designed to be ironclad, a structure that would hold up under the most intense, unrelenting scrutiny of the courtroom. The evidence, the bunker, the diaries, the forensic records, it all pointed toward a conclusion that was not just about catching a criminal, but about recognizing the sheer, terrifying persistence of a predator who had operated with the terrifying, patient calculation of an apex, urban hunter. The 1999 cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a definitive, documented, and chillingly clear record of a life that had been consumed by the darkness, and as the trial approached, the town stood on the precipice of the final, definitive, and necessary reckoning. The mystery was over, but the, now, much deeper and more painful, work of understanding was only just beginning, and as the lights of the precinct continued to burn, the focus of the entire town shifted toward the courtroom, the final, inevitable stage where the nightmare of 1999 would finally, fully, meet the light of the law. The work of the forensics team in the days leading up to the final arguments was a testament to the power of detail, a microscopic, obsessive focus on the smallest, seemingly inconsequential bits of data that, when combined, created a picture of such horrifying clarity that the defense simply had no room to move. They had analyzed every scrap of paper, every digital trail, every piece of DNA that had been waiting for the breakthrough, and they had turned it into a narrative that was, quite simply, beyond refutation. The suspect's own obsession with documentation, his need to keep a record of his achievements, had become the very thing that would ensure his permanent, total, and absolute downfall. It was a poetic, if horrifying, justice. The man who had spent 19 years trying to hide in plain sight had been caught by the very record-keeping that had allowed him to feel in control of the world he was destroying. The town, as they watched the news, as they saw the reports on the forensic findings, began to understand that they hadn't just been living next to a killer. They had been living next to a man who had turned their entire existence into a game, a theater of control that they had been participating in without ever knowing the rules. As the weeks moved toward the commencement of the formal trial, the air in the town seemed to vibrate with a tension that was less about the upcoming proceedings and more about the final release of the truth. People were no longer whispering, they were talking, they were sharing, they were trying to piece together their own individual memories of the suspect, their own personal brushes with the man who had been a part of their lives, and the cumulative effect of these revelations was a new, collective understanding of what had been hidden in their midst. They weren't just dealing with the crime of 1999 anymore. They were dealing with the history of the last 2 decades, the ways in which the suspect had influenced their town, the ways in which he had manipulated the system, and the ways in which they had been, for lack of a better term, complicit in their own ignorance. The trial was the crucible, the moment when the truth would finally, fully, and definitively be made public, and as the town prepared for the start of the final act, the silence of the night no longer felt like a threat, but like a preparation for the final, inevitable, and necessary reveal of everything that had been kept in the dark for so long. The ghost of 1999 was no longer a phantom. It was a man, a record, and a reality, and as the first day of the trial finally dawned, the sun that rose over the town felt, for the first time in 19 years, like it was lighting up a place that was no longer hiding, no longer fearing, and finally, truly, ready to look at the truth and walk into the future. The transition into the third phase of the trial felt less like a courtroom proceeding and more like the opening of a tomb that had been sealed for nearly a quarter of a century. The courtroom, a chamber of polished wood and harsh fluorescent lights, had become the stage for a dissection of the human soul, or, more accurately, the anatomy of a predator who had successfully hollowed out a life within the very heart of the community. The prosecution, led by a veteran whose voice carried the weight of decades of unresolved cases, shifted the focus from the initial abduction to the chilling, meticulously structured internal life of the suspect. They were no longer just proving that he had taken her. They were proving that he had been waiting for the opportunity to do so, a predator who had been practicing the art of silence for years before the 1999 disappearance. The evidence now presented included digital archives, a digital history that had been buried in the deep, fragmented sectors of hard drives the suspect thought had been wiped clean, but which had surrendered their ghosts to the relentless pursuit of the forensic digital unit. Each file, each folder, each fragmented note opened a window into the suspect's mind, a mind that was not a chaotic swirl of impulse, but a rigid, ordered architecture of domination. The jurors sat in a rapt, deathly silence, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: disgust, profound sorrow, and a creeping, icy realization that the man sitting just a few feet away had treated the entire town as his personal hunting ground. The defense, now completely bereft of their original strategy, sat huddled in a frantic, losing effort to object to the admissibility of the digital evidence, their arguments thin, brittle, and entirely insufficient against the sheer weight of the technical data. The judge, an anchor of immovable, dispassionate authority, overruled them with a rhythmic, predictable persistence that kept the trial moving forward like a slow, unstoppable glacier of justice. It was becoming evident that the suspect's own obsession with documentation, his need to keep a record of his control, had become the very noose that was now tightening around his neck. One of the most damning pieces of evidence introduced during this phase was a series of audio logs, recordings the suspect had kept, which functioned as a private, twisted commentary on his daily interactions with the community. To hear the voice of the man who had coached youth sports and volunteered for neighborhood cleanups discussing the victim with such chilling, clinical detachment, while simultaneously describing the mundane details of his day, created an atmosphere in the courtroom that was almost unbearable. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the complete absence of humanity, the way he could pivot from a discussion about the weather to a brutal description of his secret, underground sanctum. The jury members, some of whom had known the suspect for years, had to look away. The sight of him sitting in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of practiced, hollow stoicism, was a provocation. It was as if they were being forced to reconcile two entirely different people, and the friction of that reconciliation was creating a heat in the room that was almost physical. The victim's family, whose presence had been a steady, silent force since the start, were now undergoing a transformation that was as painful as it was necessary. For 19 years, they had been held in the state of suspended animation, their lives defined by the gap where their daughter should have been. Now, they were being forced to fill that gap with the cold, hard, and often unbearable reality of what had been happening to her. Each forensic detail, each insight into the suspect's internal world, was a new, jagged piece of the truth that they had to integrate into their understanding of her final years. The stoicism they had cultivated as a defense mechanism was beginning to crack, not into defeat, but into a raw, honest, and profound grief that seemed to ripple through the entire gallery. They weren't just mourning the person who had been taken in 1999. They were mourning the 24 years of life that had been stolen, the milestones that had never been reached, and the version of their daughter that would forever remain frozen in the memory of the town. The defense attorney, in a final, desperate act of mitigation, attempted to introduce testimony from a psychological expert who argued that the suspect suffered from a rare, specific form of neurodevelopmental isolation, a condition that supposedly hindered his ability to empathize with his actions. It was an argument that fell flat the moment it was uttered. The prosecutor's cross-examination of the expert was a masterclass in forensic psychology, exposing the suspect's behavior not as a result of a condition, but as a lifestyle, a chosen, deliberate, and highly structured pattern of predatory behavior. They systematically dismantled the expert's testimony, highlighting the suspect's high-functioning professional life, his ability to manipulate complex social structures, and his consistent, long-term pattern of planning, all of which were entirely inconsistent with the argument of a lack of functional empathy. By the time the expert stepped down from the stand, the defense's entire psychological theory of the case had been reduced to a pile of incoherent, discredited rubble. As the middle of the trial began to wane, the focus shifted to the physical reconstruction of the suspect's secret sanctum, the bunker that had been the site of his ultimate control. The forensic team utilized high-definition, three-dimensional modeling to walk the jury through the space, detailing the ventilation systems, the soundproofing, and the way the furniture had been anchored to the floor to prevent any possibility of resistance. It was a digital tour of a hell on earth, and the impact on the jury was visible, their expressions changing from shock to a cold, hard, and unshakable resolve. The prosecutor's ability to turn the abstract, dark reality of the bunker into a concrete, undeniable fact was the turning point of the entire case. There was no room left for the suspect to claim his actions were a mistake or an accident. The space itself was a confession, a permanent, physical monument to the crime he had been planning and executing for nearly a quarter of a century. Outside the courthouse, the town remained in a state of quiet, somber agitation, the news cycles now focusing entirely on the revelations coming out of the courtroom. The community was no longer searching for answers. They were reeling from the weight of the ones they had already received. The sense of betrayal was deep, a feeling that permeated the town's very bedrock, that the person they had trusted, the person they had welcomed into their homes and their organizations, had been a hollow, artificial construct designed to facilitate the destruction of the very things they held dear. People were looking at their neighbors, their friends, and their families with a new, sharper focus. The simple, neighborly interactions now weighted with the knowledge of how easily they could be manipulated. The trial had forced the town to confront the vulnerability of their own social existence, and it was a confrontation that was changing the very nature of their communal bonds. I walked the downtown district in the quiet, late evening hours after the court had adjourned, feeling the shift in the town's vibration. It was a place that had lost its innocence, but in losing it, it had gained a new, hard-won wisdom. The people were less likely to offer up their trust without cause. They were more aware of the nuances of the people around them, and they were, in their own individual ways, coming to terms with the reality of the darkness that had once been hidden beneath their own feet. The 1999 cold case was being transformed into a defining piece of the town's history, a narrative that would be taught to the next generation not just as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson in the necessity of vigilance and the, often agonizing, but necessary pursuit of the truth. The final stage of the trial, the delivery of the closing arguments, was now just over the horizon, and the feeling in the building was one of inevitable, unstoppable motion toward a conclusion. The prosecution was finalizing their roadmap to the verdict, the defense was essentially in a state of retreat, and the jury, having seen the digital files, the bunker, and the chilling testimony of the expert witnesses, were ready. I sat in the back of the courtroom for a final, brief moment, watching the sunset cast a long, golden light over the chamber, and felt the weight of all the history that had been contained within these walls. The long, agonizing weight of 19, 20, 24 years was finally, definitively, being brought to a reckoning. The truth had survived the passage of time, it had survived the suspect's careful, meticulous attempts at erasure, and it was now, finally, going to have its day in the sun. As I left the courthouse, the air was sharp and cold, a reminder of the season when it all had happened, and I felt a sense of profound, heavy certainty that the justice that had been promised to the victim and her family was finally at hand. The ghost of 1999 was no longer a phantom. It was a proven, undeniable, and now, finally, trapped reality. The mystery was over, but the work of integrating the truth into the life of the town was only just beginning, and as I walked toward my car, I felt the heavy, exhilarating burden of having witnessed the absolute, unadulterated power of the light. The long night was finally drawing to a close, and for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, the future, not just for the town, but for the memory of the victim, felt, at last, like a path that was open, clear, and finally, truly, moving forward into the day. The mystery was gone, the questions had been answered, and the nightmare, as horrible as it had been, was officially, finally, and irrevocably a thing of the past. The fourth act of this trial arrived not with a thunderous proclamation, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a scalpel. We had moved beyond the reconstruction of the crime and the psychological mapping of the suspect's shadow life. We were now entering the realm of the undeniable. The courtroom air, once crackling with the static of speculation and defense-led obstruction, had flattened into a vacuum of absolute truth. The prosecution, having laid the groundwork of the bunker, the diary, and the meticulous timeline of 1999, began the final, systematic dismantling of the suspect's remaining defenses. They were no longer arguing for conviction. They were building the monument of the verdict. Every witness called during this phase served as a pillar in that monument, a testament to the fact that the suspect's life, his job, his social standing, his daily, mundane interactions, had been nothing more than a calculated performance, a grand illusion designed to shield him from the light. The lead prosecutor, her voice carrying the weariness of a 19-year battle, presented the physical evidence recovered from the suspect's vehicle, a set of items that had been hidden in a concealed compartment beneath the spare tire for nearly a quarter of a century. It was a collection of relics, a hairbrush with strands that matched the victim's DNA, a locket that had been reported stolen in the aftermath of the disappearance, and a series of Polaroids, their edges curled and yellowed, documenting the suspect's initial observations of the victim as she went about her daily life. To see the images projected onto the large courtroom screen, the victim, unaware, buying a coffee, walking to her car, laughing with a friend, was a visceral experience. The gallery was overcome by a profound, shuddering silence. It wasn't just the fact of the abduction. It was the chilling, prolonged nature of the predator's gaze, the way he had stalked her, documenting her existence, commodifying her life until the night he finally chose to end it. The suspect, for the first time, seemed to crumble. His head, which had remained held in a rigid, defiant position for weeks slowly lowered. He became a man who was finally, for the first time in his life, being forced to look at the wreckage he had created. The prosecution didn't need to shout. They simply allowed the evidence to speak. And it spoke in a language of absolute, unarguable finality. When the forensic expert confirmed that the DNA found on the items in the car was, without a shadow of a doubt, that of the missing girl, the courtroom erupted in a way I had never seen before, not with cheers, but with a collective, jagged sound of grief that seemed to tear the very fabric of the building apart. The family of the victim stood up as one, their faces a map of the 2 decades of agony they had endured, and for the first time, the suspect met their eyes. In that glance, there was no recognition, no remorse, only the blank, empty stare of a man who is now, at long last, facing the wall. The defense attorney, a man who had staked his entire career on the suspect's supposed innocence, looked aged by years in the span of an hour. He stood to make his final objection, but the motion was hollow, a gesture of legal formality that couldn't possibly contend with the crushing weight of the physical truth. The judge, with a stern, unflinching resolve, denied the motion and allowed the prosecution to present the final, most devastating document. The suspect's own, self-written confession, a letter found in his personal safe, penned shortly after the disappearance, detailing the perfection of his deed. He had meant to keep it as a private record of his triumph, a secret to be kept until his death, but the police had found it during the final, comprehensive sweep of his property. It was the absolute, final, and definitive end to the mystery. As the letter was read aloud by the prosecutor, the silence in the courtroom was so absolute that the rustle of a paper in the back row sounded like a gunshot. The suspect had written about the abduction as if it were a scientific achievement, a moment of exquisite, controlled chaos. He described the victim's terror as something he had curated, a testament to his own power. The words were a direct line into the mind of a monster, a chilling, unapologetic, and thoroughly damning portrait of a man who had truly believed he had outsmarted the world. Listening to the words, the reality of the 1999 cold case shifted from a story of a disappearance into the reality of a murder, the final, undeniable proof that the girl had been killed within hours of her abduction. There was no more hope to cling to, no more possibility that she had been out there, living a life he had stolen. The truth was darker, sharper, and more final than anyone had dared to imagine. The impact of the letter on the jury was immediate. They sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the prosecutor as if they were seeing the suspect for the first time. The mask was gone. The neighbor, the coach, the helpful acquaintance, it was all revealed to be the skin of a snake, shed long ago. The jurors' faces were no longer masks of concentration, but of fury, a cold, hard, and justified anger that would soon be translated into the verdict that the entire community was waiting for. The judge adjourned for the day, but no one moved. The energy in the courtroom was stagnant, heavy with the weight of the revelation. It was the point of no return. The 1999 case was effectively solved, the narrative fully fleshed out, the secrets finally and painfully dragged from the darkness. I walked out of the courthouse, the evening air feeling like a cold, cleansing wash after the stifling, claustrophobic atmosphere within. The town, which had spent years defining itself by the absence of the girl, was now being forced to deal with the overwhelming presence of her truth. I saw groups of people huddled on the sidewalks, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones, the news of the letter and the DNA results moving through the town like a seismic wave. They weren't talking about the mystery anymore. They were talking about the man, the monster, and the profound, structural failure of the community to see him for who he really was. It was a conversation of realization, a sobering, necessary, and painful process of collective awakening. I returned to my hotel, the silence of the room feeling less like an empty space and more like a necessary buffer. I sat by the window, watching the lights of the town, thinking about the letter, the bunker, the Polaroids, the debris of a life stolen, and the meticulous, horrifying record of a thief. The mystery had been hollowed out, leaving only the mundane, brutal reality of the crime. I thought about the victim's family, The years they had spent living in a space that was neither here nor there, and I realized that the closure they were finally going to receive was not a cure, but a beginning. They were about to step out of the long, dark corridor they had been trapped in for nearly a quarter of a century and into a world that, while scarred, was finally, truly honest. The trial was almost over, and the shadow of 1999 was finally and definitively receding. The next morning, the final day of the trial, promised to be the day the town would finally be able to close the door on the nightmare. The detectives, the family, the community, everyone was ready for the verdict, everyone was ready for the sentence, and everyone was ready to leave the ghost of 1999 behind them. I could feel the tension, the anticipation, and the sense of inevitability in the air. The long wait was finally nearing its conclusion, and as the morning sun rose over the town, the light felt different. Not just a new day, but the start of a new, post-truth era. The nightmare was almost over, and the road ahead, for the first time in nearly 25 years, was finally, truly open. The truth had found its level, the justice was finally being served, and the nightmare was, at long last, being put to rest. The mystery of 1999 was a piece of history, and as the town looked toward the final verdict, they were ready, finally, to walk into the future without the weight of the past dragging them down. The long, agonizing night was nearing its end, and as the sun climbed higher, the light of the day finally revealed a future that was, for the first time, theirs to hold. The mystery was gone, the questions had been answered, and the nightmare was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The fifth act of this unfolding tragedy felt like a descent into the final, dark chamber of a labyrinth that had held the town captive for 24 years. The courtroom, once a place of speculative tension, had hardened into a space of clinical, almost painful reality. The jury, 12 individuals who had been tasked with carrying the burden of the community's collective conscience, looked as though they had aged a decade in the span of a few weeks. They had been forced to look at the Polaroids, to hear the contents of the diary, and to sit in the same room as the man who had transformed their suburban peace into a theater of calculated cruelty. The atmosphere was no longer about the anticipation of a mystery. It was about the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth. The prosecution, having already laid bare the bunker, the DNA evidence, and the confession letter, began the closing arguments. Her voice was steady, resonant, and echoed with a sense of duty that transcended the professional requirements of her job. She wasn't just closing a case, she was delivering a final, definitive account for a life that had been snatched from the world in the blink of an eye. She began by dismantling the last, pathetic remnants of the defense's strategy, specifically their attempt to frame the suspect's actions as the product of an isolated, psychological fugue. She systematically replaced that fantasy with the cold, hard logic of the suspect's own documented history. She reminded the jury of the Polaroids, of the meticulously charted routes of the victim's daily life, and of the structural, permanent nature of the underground bunker. This was not a mistake, she stated, her words sharp as flint. This was a life's work. This was a man who decided, with total, unclouded intent, that he possessed the right to dismantle a human being for his own, private, and utterly sick satisfaction. The jury sat in a silence, so profound it felt as though the very air had been vacuumed from the room. The victim's family, sitting in the front row, remained a monolith of controlled, searing grief, their eyes fixed on the prosecutor as if she were the only thing holding their reality together. They weren't looking for mercy. They were looking for the seal on the file, the final, binding resolution that would allow them to stop being defined by the missing and start being defined by the known. The defense attorney's closing argument was, in comparison, a hollow exercise in legal formality. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the fallibility of memory, and of the risks of punishing a man based on a narrative that had been constructed over 2 decades of obsession. It was an argument made of dust, a desperate attempt to create a fog where there was only blinding, incandescent light. As he spoke, the suspect, the neighbor, the coach, the monster, sat with his gaze fixed on the table, his physical form looking small, shrunken, and fundamentally powerless. The performance he had sustained for 24 years had finally, permanently broken. He was a man who had existed in the reflected light of his own deception, and now that the light had been turned off, there was nothing left of him but the cold, hard, and undeniable facts of his crime. When the jury was finally sequestered, the town went into a state of suspended animation. The courthouse, which had been the pulsating heart of the drama, felt like a hollowed-out shell. The streets, once familiar and comforting, took on a surreal quality. The residents caught in the strange, eerie waiting period between the end of the evidence and the beginning of the verdict. You could feel it in the air, a heavy, expectant pressure, a collective holding of the breath that seemed to be shared by every living soul in the county. It was the feeling of a clock that had been stopped for 24 years and was now finally, inevitably, starting to tick again. People moved through their days with a slow, deliberate quality, their conversations hushed, their eyes constantly checking the news, the phones, the screens, waiting for the signal that would define the rest of their lives. I spent those hours of deliberation in the park, the place where the victim had last been seen, the place that had become the town's own private landscape of trauma. It felt different now. The trees didn't seem as imposing, the shadows didn't seem as deep, and the silence was no longer the silence of an unsolved mystery. It was the silence of a memorial. The town had finally begun to understand what it meant to live in the wake of the truth. They were no longer victims of an unknown, creeping fear. They were a community that had seen their own demons, unmasked them, and were now in the process of deciding how to carry the weight of that knowledge. The verdict, whatever it was, would not fix the brokenness, but it would change the nature of it. It would allow them to stop wondering and start processing, to stop fearing the dark and start acknowledging the light. When the word finally came through, a rapid-fire notification on 1,000 devices, a sudden surge in the activity on the streets, the town didn't erupt in cheers. It erupted in a profound, soul-deep shudder. The jury had reached a verdict, and the courthouse doors were opening. The rush to the building was a chaotic, desperate surge of humanity, people moving with the singular, frantic purpose of those who are finally, after a lifetime of waiting, going to witness the end of the long, dark night. The courtroom was packed, the air so thin it was a struggle to breathe, the pressure of the moment so intense it felt like the physical walls of the building were groaning under the weight of it. As the judge took the bench, the silence was absolute, a heavy, crushing stillness that seemed to bridge the gap between the agony of 1999 and the reality of the present. The foreman of the jury, a person whose face had been the picture of measured, methodical focus for the entire trial, stood up to read the verdict. The paper in his hand seemed to pulse with the weight of the last 24 years. As he uttered the word guilty, the impact was not a sound, but a force, a shockwave of relief, of grief, and of a final, binding justice that hit the room with the force of a tidal wave. The victim's family, in a moment of pure, raw, and shattering human emotion, collapsed into each other's arms, their sobs the only sound in the room, a release of nearly a quarter-century of held breath, of broken sleep, and of the agonizing, corrosive uncertainty that had defined their lives. They were finally, at long last, whole in their tragedy. They knew, and they were heard. The suspect, standing as the verdict was read, remained as he had been for days, a hollow, shrunken husk. He didn't look at the family, he didn't look at the jury, and he didn't look at the judge. He was a man who had already been rendered irrelevant by the verdict, his influence, his control, and his story finally, definitively, taken out of his hands and placed into the firm, unblinking grip of the law. As the judge began the sentencing, the rhythm of the language, life without the possibility of parole, was the final, closing note in a symphony of horror that had played for far too long. The bailiff stepped in, the handcuffs clicked, and the man who had been the phantom of 1999 was led out of the room, not as a neighbor, not as a coach, and not as a master of secrets, but as a convicted murderer, a non-person who would spend the rest of his life in the dark, silent, and entirely powerless environment of the prison system. The exit from the courthouse was a blur of emotion, reporters scrambling for quotes, people weeping openly in the corridors, and the investigators, the ones who had lived with the 1999 file as their constant, nagging companion, sharing a quiet, intense, and deeply personal moment of relief. They had done it. They had reached the end of the road. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, the air cool and crisp against my skin, watching the sun begin to set over the town. The mystery was gone, the truth was out, and the nightmare, while it would forever leave its mark on the soul of the community, was finally, irrevocably, over. The town was moving forward, and as I looked out at the street, I saw the first signs of the life that would continue. A child running, a store opening, the simple, mundane, and beautiful continuation of the world after the truth had finally been spoken. I felt the immense weight of the story, the way it had pulled at the fabric of the community, and I realized that the trial wasn't just about the verdict. It was about the power of the human spirit to endure, to seek, and to hold on to the truth until the darkness finally gave way. We had seen the worst of human nature, but we had also seen the most persistent, enduring, and necessary of human virtues. The 1999 cold case was a part of history, a narrative that was finally complete, and the town, for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, was free to look ahead. The long night had ended, and as the lights began to flicker on in the town one by one, they were no longer beacons of fear. They were the lights of a community that was finally, beginning to live again in the light of the truth. The mystery was at rest, the truth was finally home, and the town, battle-hardened and weary, was ready to take its first, unburdened step into the future. The sentencing hearing, held in a courtroom that felt unnaturally antiseptic after the weeks of raw, chaotic testimony, served as the final, grinding movement in a long, agonizing symphony. The air was thin, almost sterile, as if the very atmosphere of the room was trying to cleanse itself of the trauma that had been exhumed and laid bare over the preceding month. The defendant sat motionless, his shoulders hunched, a hollowed-out figure who looked less like a man and more like the discarded husk of a secret that had finally been hollowed out by the weight of its own gravity. He did not speak, he did not protest. He simply sat, staring at the polished mahogany table with the vacant, unblinking eyes of someone who had already departed from the world of the living, long before the cell door had clicked shut for the last time. The prosecution's final statement was not a roar, but a whisper of iron. They didn't need to incite the jury further or appeal to the passions of the gallery. They simply laid the facts of the 1999 case on the table, a final, definitive accounting of a life stolen, a family fractured, and a community held in a state of suspended, anxious animation for nearly a quarter of a century. They spoke of the cold, hard reality of the victim's final moments, the deliberate, chilling choices the defendant had made, and the sheer, staggering arrogance of his attempt to vanish into the folds of a suburban life, as if he could simply wash the past from his hands and start again as an honest man. It was a searing, indicting narrative that left no room for ambiguity, no space for the defense to maneuver, and no comfort for the perpetrator. As the judge prepared to read the sentence, the room fell into a silence, so profound it felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist. This was the moment that the victim's family had been waiting for since that autumn night in 1999, the moment that the long, dark shadow of the cold case would finally be cast aside by the cold, unequivocal stroke of the law. When the words were finally spoken, when the number of years was announced, a number that effectively ensured the defendant would never again walk in the sun, a collective, shaky breath shuddered through the gallery. It wasn't a celebration, nor was it a relief. It was an acknowledgement. The debt was being called in. The reckoning was complete. I looked at the lead detective, the man whose career had been largely defined by his refusal to let this case go. He stood in the back of the room, his face etched with the weariness of a long, brutal campaign. He didn't smile, he didn't even relax. He simply nodded, a singular, sharp gesture of finality. He had reached the end of his mountain, and the view from the peak was not a panorama of glory, but a somber reflection on the cost of the climb. He had seen the truth, he had secured the justice, and he had done what he had sworn to do. But he knew as well as anyone that the truth is a double-edged sword. It frees you from the lie, but it leaves you forever marked by the weight of the reality you have uncovered. The defendant was escorted out by the bailiffs, his handcuffs clinking in a rhythmic, final cadence that signaled the end of his agency. He was no longer a person of the world. He was a ward of the state, a relic of a crime that had finally lost its mystery. As the door closed behind him, the courtroom seemed to physically shift, the tension that had held it taut for weeks beginning to drain away into the floorboards. The gallery began to empty, people moving with the slow, dazed motions of those who have witnessed an earthquake and are only now realizing they are still standing. The 1999 cold case was now a matter of record, a closed file, a piece of history that would be tucked away in the dusty cabinets of the judicial archives, rarely to be opened again. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, a jarring, physical reminder that life, in all its mundane, unscripted indifference, continued. The sun was setting over the city, casting long, orange shadows across the courthouse steps, turning the building into a silhouette of absolute, rigid authority. People were getting into their cars, heading home to their own lives, to the quiet, unexamined comfort of their own homes. The 1999 murder had been the central, pulsing heart of their community's identity for so long that its resolution felt like a form of amputation. They were relieved, yes, but they were also unmoored. They had built their fears, their precautions, and their stories around the mystery of that night, and now that mystery was gone. They were left to grapple with the aftermath of a reality they had tried to avoid, and the weight of their own culpability in having let the truth remain hidden for so long. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the city lights flicker to life. The mystery was resolved, the case was closed, and the monster was caged. It was the ending that everyone had prayed for, the ending that the victim deserved, and yet there was no sense of a clean, bright dawn. There was only the long, lingering twilight of a story that had consumed so many years. The 1999 cold case had been a long, dark corridor, and we had finally emerged on the other side, but we were all changed. The detectives were older, the family was broken and then slowly, painfully mended, and the town was more cynical, more careful, and more aware of the darkness that can thrive in the heart of the ordinary. The story is not about the crime itself, but about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. It is a story about the stubborn, irrational, and absolutely vital belief that the truth matters, that the life of the victim is not a disposable thing, and that no matter how deep the shadows, no matter how much time passes, the light will eventually find its way into the dark. We had spent 24 years in the grip of a secret, and now we were free. But freedom, I realized, is not the absence of the past. It is the ability to carry it without being crushed by it. The 1999 cold case was our burden, and now we had set it down. The path ahead was unknown, but it was open, and for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, the only thing waiting for us in the dark was the future, not a predator. As I turned to leave, I saw a lone figure walking toward the courthouse, a young woman who looked like she might have been a child when the crime occurred. She stopped at the steps, looking up at the stone building with a gaze that was both curious and solemn. She wasn't part of the investigation, and she wasn't a relative of the victim, but she, like everyone else in this town, had been touched by the shadow of the 1999 case. She was part of the generation that was growing up in the world after the truth, a world where the mystery had been solved and the ghosts had been laid to rest. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away, her steps firm and confident. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it felt like a final, beautiful affirmation. The cycle had been broken, the history had been written, and the town was finally, irrevocably, moving into a new, uncharted, and entirely honest era. The long, agonizing wait was finally, and definitively, over. The truth, which had been buried for 24 years, had risen, and it had proven to be the only thing that could set us free. We would carry the memory of the 1999 cold case forever. A reminder of our fragility, our tenacity, and the hard-fought necessity of the truth. But we would carry it as a memory, a story told in the quiet of the night, no longer as a shadow that dictated our lives. The long night was over, And as I walked toward my car, the silence of the night no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise that, despite all the darkness and all the secrets, we are still capable of finding our way into the light, of demanding justice, and of standing in the truth, come what may. The 1999 cold case was finished, but the truth, the beautiful, searing, and absolute truth, was finally home, where it belonged, etched into the bedrock of our town's story, for as long as we were there to remember it. The aftermath of the sentencing left the courtroom a ghost town of discarded papers and lingering tension. The legal teams retreated to their offices, their work done, their victory or defeat sealed in the records of the state. The detectives, those architects of the truth who had spent their careers under the shadow of the 1999 file, found themselves in a strange, liminal space. They had achieved what they had spent decades trying to do, and yet the transition to a world without that case felt like a form of mourning. They were professional, disciplined, and seasoned, but they were also human, and humans require context, rhythm, and a sense of purpose. When that purpose is fulfilled after such an immense expenditure of time and soul, the sudden cessation of that purpose can be as overwhelming as the stress that preceded it. They spent their final days in the office not working, but reflecting, sharing the quiet camaraderie of those who have survived a long, arduous campaign. The victim's family, too, found themselves in a position that was difficult to articulate. For 24 years, they had been the victim's family, a title that held a specific, heavy, and often public weight. Now, they were just a family, one that had been irrevocably altered by time and tragedy, yet one that had reached the end of their search. The peace they had finally achieved was not the peace of resolution, but the peace of exhaustion. They were able to lay down the burden of the question, to stop asking what happened, and to focus on the quieter, more personal work of mourning. Their dignity throughout the trial had been a pillar for the entire community, a reminder that the human spirit is capable of absorbing immense trauma without breaking, provided there is the promise of truth at the end of the long, cold night. Outside, the town began to shift, the landscape of their daily existence undergoing a quiet, subtle transformation. The park where the victim was last seen, a place that had been a site of pilgrimages, of fearful avoidance, and of intense, collective speculation, was undergoing a renovation. The town council had decided to dedicate a new, dedicated space for public gathering and reflection, a place where people could come to remember, not just the tragedy, but the resilience of the community in its aftermath. It was a physical sign of the town's intent to move forward, to turn the soil of their trauma and plant something new in its place. The 1999 case would remain a part of their history, a foundational element of the story of who they were and how they had survived, but it would no longer be the center of their reality. I spent my final evening in the town sitting in the new park, watching the lights turn on in the windows of the houses nearby. It was a scene of such mundane, ordinary beauty that it was difficult to reconcile with the horror that had once been the focus of my attention. And yet that was the point. The world had continued, the cycle of life had persisted, and the truth, no matter how long it had stayed buried, had finally, definitively, found its way out into the light. My journey had reached its end. I had seen the transformation from the cold, silent mystery of 1999 to the hard, searing truth of the conviction, and I felt a sense of profound, quiet gratitude for the chance to witness it. The town was free, the mystery was solved, and the dawn, that true, honest, and unburdened dawn, was finally here. I stood up, left the park, and started my car, driving away with the sense of a job finally done and a story finally, at long last, put to rest. The highway ahead was wide, clear, and illuminated by the soft, steady glow of the moon. As I drove, I thought about the files, the detectives, the family, and the way the town had stood up and faced its own darkness. It was a story of human failure, yes, but it was also a story of human success, a testament to the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only a long, delayed, and often agonizingly complex path to the truth. And as long as there are people who refuse to look away, people who insist on the truth, and people who are willing to do the hard, grueling work of justice, the truth will always have a way of finding its way to the surface. The 1999 cold case was finished, a completed historical reality, and as I drove into the night, the road ahead felt like a blank page, ready for a story that was, for the first time in nearly 25 years, entirely, irrevocably, their own. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the long, agonizing wait was finally, definitively, over. The sentencing phase of the trial did not merely bring the legal proceedings to a close. It served as a symbolic exorcism for the entire community. As the judge laid out the final, ironclad terms of the defendant's incarceration, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a sanctuary where a long-held, collective breath was finally being released. The defendant, who for 24 years had built a life on the fragile, permeable membrane of a lie, sat motionless. His stillness was not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a man who had been hollowed out by the sheer, crushing weight of the truth. He had spent 2 decades believing that his secret was his sanctuary, that the darkness he had cultivated was impenetrable, and now he was facing the reality that his sanctuary was a cage, and his secret was the key that had locked him inside for the rest of his natural life. The prosecutor, standing to deliver her final remarks before the sentencing, chose not to focus on the technicalities of the law, but on the enduring, haunting nature of the loss. She spoke of the victim not as a subject of an investigation, but as a person who had been denied the basic, inherent right to exist, to grow, and to define her own destiny. Her voice, measured and resonant, filled the room, weaving together the fragmented, painful history of the last 24 years into a cohesive narrative of human resilience. She addressed the family directly, acknowledging the unique, devastating burden they had carried, the burden of the missing, the state of living in a purgatory where the question was always present, but the answer was forever denied. Her words were a final, necessary validation of their struggle, a public acknowledgement that their persistence had been the light that led everyone back to this moment of reckoning. As the sentence was finalized, the courtroom remained in a state of profound, absolute stillness. There were no outbursts of triumph, no cries of vengeance. There was only the cold, hard, and undeniable weight of justice being served. It was a moment of profound, sobering clarity. The mystery that had baffled the town since 1999, the enigma that had become the defining feature of the local landscape, had been reduced to the stark, bureaucratic reality of a life sentence. The defendant was led away by the bailiffs, his handcuffs clinking in a rhythm that felt like the final, metallic strike of a gavel that had been echoing for nearly a quarter of a century. He disappeared through the heavy wooden door, and with him went the last, tangible vestige of the nightmare he had authored. The exodus from the courthouse was a somber, reflective process. People walked out into the crisp afternoon air, their faces a map of relief, grief, and the dawning realization of what lay ahead. The town, which had spent so long defining itself by the absence of the girl, now had to begin the arduous process of defining itself by the presence of the truth. This was not a quick fix. It was the start of a new, complex chapter. For the detectives, the transition was the most profound. They had lived with the 1999 file as their constant, nagging companion, the unfinished business that colored every other case they worked. Now, with the files closed and the case sealed, they were facing a void, a professional and personal silence that was both liberating and disorienting. They shared a quiet nod in the parking lot, an acknowledgement of the shared, grueling road they had walked together before driving off into the deepening dusk. For the victim's family, the post-trial period was not an end, but a transition into a new, uncharted terrain of mourning. They had finally reached the resolution they had sought for 24 years, but the resolution had not, and could not, bring back what had been stolen. They were now free to mourn the person, rather than the mystery. They could finally stop looking for answers in every corner, every shadow, and every passing face, and start the slow, quiet work of integrating the truth into their own personal narratives. They were no longer the missing girl's family. A title that held a specific, heavy, and often public weight, but a family that had survived an unimaginable storm and was now, slowly, finding its footing on the other side. Their dignity, their patience, and their unrelenting commitment to the truth had been the steady, beating heart of the entire ordeal, and they were finally, at long last, able to live without the crushing weight of the unknown. The town itself began the slow, delicate work of social integration. The revelation that their neighbor, the helpful, smiling man who had lived among them for decades, was actually a predator, had done more than just shock them. It had fundamentally dismantled their social fabric. People were more reserved, more observant, and more conscious of the masks that were worn in their daily lives. The neighborliness that had once been the town's pride was now seasoned with a new, necessary level of skepticism. They had learned the hard way that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones held behind a closed, ordinary-looking door. They weren't becoming a cynical, hateful community, but they were becoming a more honest one. They were no longer willing to settle for the surface appearance of things, a change that felt like a permanent, foundational shift in how they interacted with one another. The media, as fickle as a mountain wind, had long since packed its bags and moved on to the next tragedy, the next sensational headline, the next case of the century. The town was left with the reality of its own story, a narrative that belonged only to them. They didn't need the validation of the national news cycle anymore. They had the truth, they had the record, and they had the peace of knowing that the 1999 chapter was officially, irrevocably closed. I spent my final days in the town interviewing the residents, capturing their reflections as the shock began to fade into the deeper, quieter currents of history. An elderly woman, who had lived on the same street as the victim, told me that for the first time in 24 years, she felt she could walk past the house without looking over her shoulder. It was a small, profound statement, one that captured the essence of the freedom the town had been granted, the freedom to live without the low-level, pervasive fear of a shadow that wasn't there. The house where the tragedy had occurred, the house that had served as the physical anchor for the ghost of 1999, was being renovated. The new owners were stripping away the old, dark, and heavy elements of the structure, replacing them with light, airy, and modern finishes. It was a literal, physical manifestation of the town's intent to move forward. They were not ignoring the past, they were recontextualizing it, transforming the site of the horror into a place of new, hopeful beginnings. The history was there, etched into the foundation, but the house itself was being reclaimed for the living. It was a powerful, quiet victory, a testament to the fact that even the most persistent shadows can eventually be eclipsed by the light of the present. As I took my final walk through the town, the air felt different, no longer the heavy, stagnant air of an unsolved mystery, but the fresh, moving air of a place that was breathing again. I realized then that my own journey had come to a definitive end. I had entered the region as an outsider looking for a story, and I was leaving as someone who had been deeply moved by the tenacity and the grace of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by a single, senseless act of violence. I had seen how the truth could be a transformative power, how it could tear down the walls of deception and build a foundation for a new, honest beginning. I had learned that justice, while often delayed, is an essential, life-affirming process that allows a community to reclaim its own story. The 1999 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. The archives of the 1999 case, once a disorganized, chaotic mountain of conflicting theories and dead-end leads, had been reorganized into a final, coherent volume. I was allowed a final look at the documents, the police reports, the witness statements, the forensic analysis, the diary entries that had been the pivot point of the trial. It was a sobering experience to hold the history of the case in my hands, to see the physical manifestation of 24 years of human effort, frustration, and eventual triumph. It was a record of the truth, stripped of all its mystery, standing naked and unassailable. I thought about the sheer number of people whose lives had been redirected by these papers, the detectives who had grown old chasing the ghost, the family who had spent the best years of their lives waiting for this moment, and the suspect who had built his life on the hollowed-out center of this murder. As I reached my car and prepared to leave the town behind, I took one last look at the quiet, ordinary streets. They didn't feel haunted anymore. They felt like a place where life was happening, where the future was being written, and where the past was finally, correctly, held in its proper place. My final report would not be about the mechanics of the crime or the brilliance of the investigation, but about the resilience of the community and the enduring power of the truth. I had started this journey with a series of questions, and I was leaving with a set of answers that were as final as they were sobering. The truth was not the comforting, tidy conclusion I had once expected. It was a complex, painful, and often ugly reality. But it was the truth, and in the end, that was the only thing that could allow them to move forward. The long, agonizing wait was over. The ghost of 1999 had been exorcised, the records were sealed, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The 1999 case was history, and history, finally, had been told in its entirety, leaving nothing behind but the quiet, steady progress of a life that was finally, truly, its own. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the nightmare was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The conclusion of the legal saga did not immediately erase the memory of the 1999 case. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense, collective retrospection that permeated every facet of the community's existence. The town, having lived for nearly a quarter of a century in the shadow of a mystery that seemed both insurmountable and omnipresent, was now grappling with the reality of its resolution. The silence that had once been filled with speculation and fear was now replaced by a more nuanced, contemplative quiet. People were not just talking about the murder anymore, they were talking about the fragility of their own perceptions. They were analyzing how they had moved through their days, trusting a man who had orchestrated the very thing they feared, all while maintaining the veneer of a productive, contributing neighbor. This self-examination was the final, necessary piece of the community's healing process, a way to ensure that the ghost of the 1999 case would not be replaced by a new, equally debilitating suspicion. In the local schools, teachers began to integrate lessons on forensic science and the nature of the criminal justice system into their curricula, using the now concluded case as a sober example of the importance of vigilance, evidence-based reasoning, and the slow but inexorable march of justice. It was a way of grounding the trauma in something educational, something that could provide the next generation with the tools to understand the darkness that had once threatened their peace. Meanwhile, at the local community center, a memorial fund in the victim's name was established, aimed at supporting families affected by long-term, unresolved tragedies. It was a way of turning the long-standing pain of the community into a resource, a way of ensuring that the victim would be remembered not just as a name on a police report, but as a source of strength and support for others who found themselves in similar, agonizing situations. The shift from mourning to action was a clear indicator of a town that had finally, successfully, stepped out from under the cloud. I spent my final days in the region documenting the physical changes that were being made to the town's landscape, a new park, a renovated community library, and the quiet, steady improvements to the infrastructure that had been neglected during the long, preoccupied years of the investigation. It felt as though the town was physically manifesting its desire to build a future that was not defined by the past. The house where the murder had occurred, now freshly painted and occupied by a young family with no knowledge of its dark history, stood as a symbol of this transition. It was no longer a crime scene. It was a home. The trauma had been scrubbed from its walls, not just by the new coat of paint, but by the passage of time and the finality of the court's verdict. The life that was being lived inside was a testament to the fact that, eventually, even the most persistent shadows are eclipsed by the light of the present. The investigative team, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound sense of closure that had been 24 years in the making. They had hosted a small, private dinner to commemorate the end of the case, a gathering not of celebration, but of reflection. They spoke of the colleagues who had moved on, retired, or passed away during the long, exhausting search, and they acknowledged the contribution of every person who had touched the file over the last 2 decades and more. It was a recognition that the resolution was the result of a cumulative effort, a relay race where the baton had been passed from one generation of investigators to the next. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the case had been a singular challenge that had pushed them to the limits of their professional and personal capacities, and that the satisfaction of the verdict was a reward that they had truly earned. They were no longer the cold case team. They were just professionals who had done their duty, and that was enough. The suspect, now fully integrated into the prison's internal structure, was becoming a footnote. His influence, which had once been a source of terror and curiosity, had been utterly neutralized. The world outside, the town he had manipulated, and the life he had stolen were moving on without him. He was a relic of his own ambition, a man who had traded his humanity for a sense of control and had lost everything in the process. His name would eventually fade from the public consciousness, his crime relegated to a line item in a textbook or a footnote in a true crime documentary, but for the community, he would always be the man who turned their quiet, ordinary life into a theater of horror. And that, in its own way, was the final, perfect justice. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be the architect of something significant, and he had succeeded. Only not as the mastermind he had imagined himself to be, but as a cautionary, pathetic symbol of how small, petty, and ultimately hollow his motives had truly been. As I looked back at the town from the vantage point of the highway, I realized that my own journey had come to a definitive end. I had entered the region as an outsider looking for a story, and I was leaving as someone who had been deeply moved by the tenacity and the grace of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by a single, senseless act of violence. I had seen how the truth could be a transformative power, how it could tear down the walls of deception and build a foundation for a new, honest beginning. I had learned that justice, while often delayed, is an essential, life-affirming process that allows a community to reclaim its own story. The 1999 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. The final report that I would file would be a testament to this resilience, a story not about the crime, but about the people who had refused to give up, the detectives who had chased the shadows, the family who had held on to their hope, and the community that had found the strength to look at the truth and move forward. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 1999 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The story of the 1999 case was finished, but the story of the town was only just beginning, a new chapter that would be written, day by day, in the light of the truth, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The mystery was gone, but the town remained, a place of peace, of progress, and of the quiet, enduring strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you have come from. The long wait was over, and the future, finally, was wide open. In those closing moments of my departure, I reflected on the nature of cold cases. We call them cold because the trail has grown faint, the memories have blurred, and the evidence has, in some cases, literally begun to degrade. But the term is a misnomer. These cases are never cold. They are white-hot with the latent energy of the victims, the investigators, and the families who keep them alive in the furnace of their own determination. They are the most human of all crimes because they represent the refusal to accept that a life can simply be erased, that a story can be stopped mid-sentence. The 1999 case was not a failure of the system. It was the ultimate test of the system, a test that was passed not by a singular stroke of genius, but by the relentless, grinding, and often unglamorous work of people who believed that the truth was worth the cost of the pursuit. The road ahead was now a canvas for the town to paint its own future. The shadow of the abduction had acted as a filter, distorting their perception of the world and their place within it. Now that filter was removed. The clarity that remained was sharp, at times painful, but it was authentic. They were a community that had survived an ordeal that would have shattered others, and they were stronger for it. They understood the value of the mundane, the simple, quiet routine of a morning school run, the neighborly nod, the safety of a locked door, because they knew how easily it could be stripped away. This awareness wasn't a weight, it was a compass. It directed them toward a future that was defined by gratitude, by vigilance, and by a profound, shared understanding of the sanctity of a single life. As I checked my rearview mirror one last time, the town became a collection of small, flickering lights against the darkening horizon. It felt less like a place of history and more like a place of life. The story was over, but the lives that had been saved by the truth, the lives of the next generation who would grow up without the fear, the lives of the family who had found their peace, and the lives of the investigators who could finally rest, were just beginning. The long, cold, dark night of 1999 had finally, and for good, given way to the light of a morning that was entirely their own. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the future, at last, was finally, truly free. The wait had been long, the cost had been absolute, but the resolution was complete, and the truth, for all its weight, had finally set them free. The echoes of the 1999 case were finally fading, not into oblivion, but into the quiet, sturdy fabric of local history. As I sat in the town's oldest cafe, the same one where I had spent countless hours during the trial, I noticed a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The hushed, conspiratorial tones of the past had been replaced by the normal, mundane chatter of daily life. Complaints about the rising price of timber, the upcoming local sports season, and the trivialities of school board meetings. The 1999 mystery was no longer a suffocating, pervasive presence that seemed to steal the air from the room. It had been folded into the town's collective narrative, like a ghost story that had finally been explained by a rational light. There was a sense of profound psychological stabilization, a collective exhale that had spanned months, and now, the town was finding its rhythm again. It was a rhythm defined not by the shadow of a 24-year-old disappearance, but by the tangible, ordinary pulse of the present. The detectives, once the protagonists of this grueling saga, were also finding their footing in the post-case world. I met with the former lead of the cold case unit one last time, in a small office that felt significantly less cluttered than it had during the trial. The stacks of evidence boxes were gone, replaced by the mundane administrative tasks that constitute the majority of police work. We talked about the nature of persistence, about the fine line between dedication and obsession, and about the rare, fleeting moments of satisfaction that make the long, frustrating years of investigation worthwhile. He expressed a sentiment that resonated with everything I had observed, that the resolution of a case like 1999's wasn't just about the verdict, it was about the restoration of order to a chaotic world. It was about confirming the fundamental human belief that actions have consequences, that the truth is not a negotiable commodity, and that no matter how cleverly a secret is buried, the relentless process of law will eventually unearth it. For the victim's family, the passage of time had begun to provide a different kind of clarity. They were no longer the figures of tragedy they had been at the start of the trial. They were simply a family, once again, dealing with the ups and downs of existence. The resolution had given them the freedom to mourn without the distraction of the unknown. They could now look back at their loved one's life as a complete, coherent story, rather than a narrative that had been abruptly and cruelly cut off in the dark. They had found their peace, a quiet, internal reconciliation that was far more potent than any public statement could ever be. I watched them from a distance at a community event, saw the way they interacted with their neighbors, the way they seemed unburdened, and it was the most powerful testament to the necessity of the justice they had pursued for so long. They had survived, and in surviving, they had become the architects of their own healing. The legal system, which had been the arena for this conflict, was already shifting its focus to other matters. The judge had moved on to the next docket. The lawyers were preparing for their next motions, and the machinery of justice was churning forward, indifferent to the personal narratives it consumed. This was the nature of the beast. It was a relentless, grinding process that didn't stop for tears or catharsis. But for those involved, the detectives, the family, the community, the 1999 cold case was a life-defining event. It was a bookmark in their history, a point of reference that would organize the rest of their lives. When they spoke of the years that followed, they would always have to account for the shadow cast by that autumn night in 1999. It was the before and the after that would always be the heartbeat of their perspective. I took one final drive through the residential streets, the ones that had been the backdrop for the suspect's 24-year deception. It was a mundane, suburban landscape, but looking at it now, with the knowledge of what had truly occurred, it felt like a different world. The house that had once been the center of the mystery was just a structure of wood and brick, and the streets were just thoroughfares for the daily commute. The fear that had once been mapped onto these streets had been replaced by a more grounded, realistic understanding of the world. The town was no longer a place where a monster could hide in plain sight. It was a place that had learned to keep its eyes open. That awareness, that newfound clarity, was the greatest shield they could ever have. The archive, that dark, silent repository of 24 years of frustration, was finally closed. I realized then that my own journey had come to a definitive end. I had entered the region as an outsider looking for a story, and I was leaving as someone who had been deeply moved by the tenacity and the grace of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by a single, senseless act of violence. I had seen how the truth could be a transformative power, how it could tear down the walls of deception and build a foundation for a new, honest beginning. I had learned that justice, while often delayed, is an essential, life-affirming process that allows a community to reclaim its own story. The 1999 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. The final report that I would file would be a testament to this resilience, a story not about the crime, but about the people who had refused to give up, the detectives who had chased the shadows, the family who had held onto their hope, and the community that had found the strength to look at the truth and move forward. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 1999 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The story of the 1999 case was finished, but the story of the town was only just beginning, a new chapter that would be written, day by day, in the light of the truth, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The mystery was gone, but the town remained, a place of peace, of progress, and of the quiet, enduring strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you have come from. The long wait was over, and the future, finally, was wide open.